Hello everybody, members and supporters of the British Museum. It's great to be able to talk to you. I'm Clive Gamble, an archaeologist, and I was once a trustee of the museum. I wanted to share with you today some thoughts about how we became a global species. It's something that I've been interested in for some time and have written about it. I'll show you the book later. But it's a fascinating story of when, where, and why we came to be a global species. And to cut to the chase, we became a global species quite late in our evolution, sometime after about 50,000 years ago. So that's interesting because we have another 3 million years before that to talk about. The why is something that will take a little longer than 10 minutes to really get to, but I want to give you some pointers towards that. And the how is what I really want to dwell on here. And putting it into a sort of context, at the end of the Ice Age, about 11,000 years ago, when the ice sheets retreat, the seas rise, the warmth comes back, the best estimate for the number of people scattered around the world is about 7 million. And of course, today it's 7 billion. And what we have in the British Museum is the archaeology, the history, the ethnography of really the 7 billion. And what I want to just briefly talk to you about is the archaeology of that deep human history for the 7 million, from 11,000 way back in time. Because if you ask the question, how did people achieve this global settlement of the world, then yes, technology was important. You always need boats to get to Easter Island. You always need sleds and good clothing to get into the Arctic and all those sorts of things. But most importantly, and what really distinguishes us as humans, as opposed to our closest relatives, the apes and the monkeys, is that we're the one species that is able to live apart but stay in touch, that we're able to scatter ourselves around. This might just be over 1 year, it might be over a season, it might be, as we're all experiencing at the moment, and we hope for just a few months, or it might be for a very long period of time, this separation from our basic social units, from what we know from our families, from our households, from our immediate friends, and so on. And that's the thing that humans have been able to do, and which the museum does have objects which point as to how that was achieved. Because we know for the 7 billion that it's relatively easy. I mean, here am I talking to you through the wonders of digital technology and staying in touch. And I came across this when I was writing my book on settling the earth. I came across this wonderful poem by a Greek poet, Palladas, who lived in Alexandria during the 4th century AD. I came across it on the Poems on the Underground, and it's translated brilliantly, I think, by Tony Harrison. And there's just one verse which I want to read to you because it sums up this living apart but staying in touch. It goes like this: loving the rituals that keep men close, nature created means for friends apart. Pen, paper, ink, the alphabet, signs for the distant and disconsolate heart. Well, that suits the 7 billion very nicely because, of course, there is written texts through much of that period. There is writing, and now there's digital technologies. But what about before that? For the 7 million, starting at 11,000 years ago and going way back to 3 million years ago. Well, there's language for some of that period, but not for all of it. Language is probably about 500,000 years old, although there are many people who will dispute that, and we could have a very good argument about that, and it would be great fun. But even within that long time span, language is actually quite recent. So how did they do this? Because think about those people. They're hunters and gatherers. They're very mobile. They're moving around landscapes. They've got another tactic for coping with the environment, which is to split apart. The technical term is fission, and then they fuse back again. And they do this on a seasonal basis as there are things to hunt and gather and eat, plants and animals and so on. And they come back together. So when they're all together, they're all, in their social group, and then they fragment and go around the landscapes, but they still somehow stay in touch. And what we see through this very long period of time and evolution is that we get better and better at living apart, so that we can then contemplate getting on those boats and going into the deep Pacific, or going into environments where periods of separation are forced on us by the conditions of existence, by the food that's available, and so on. And yet it's still possible to maintain a social life. Now, if you quickly look at our primate cousins, and it'd be great to put up a picture of some of them now, of course, our primate cousins are the original fingertip societies. They spend an enormous amount of time touching and grooming each other in order to establish hierarchies, in order to cement those social bonds. Because through using those fingertips in that way, they're releasing the endorphins in the body, and grooming is an extremely pleasurable activity for primates, as it is for ourselves. And that's the strength of the bonds, but it depends on a lot of daily contact, a lot of that close physical contact. And that's what's difficult when you're living apart. So that's why primate societies, by and large, tend to stay together. They see each other on a daily basis. And I have the distinct impression that if they don't see each other, they're not thinking about each other in the way that we think about loved ones who we're not directly in contact with, or what we might be doing with a friend in a week's time when we go to the cinema, or whatever it might be. That they're not spending a great deal of time thinking in those sorts of ways. And with some colleagues, Robin Dunbar and John Gowlett, I researched that recently in a book called Thinking Big, of looking at how our primate ancestors differ from us, and in particular how the brains differ. Not so much in the structure of the brains, but in the size of the brain. And Robin Dunbar had made this suggestion some years ago, or this demonstration, that the size of the brain in primates correlates very nicely with the size of those social groups which they maintain on a daily basis, where they get their fingers working and they reinforce the social bonds with these emotional releases of these opiates that naturally occur in the body and which are released during social grooming. And we looked at this, and Robin had made the suggestion some time ago that if you look at that and then you trace where humans should be on a primate graph, our number of people in these interactions is about 150. This is now known as Dunbar's number. Look it up on Google and you'll see it in all its glory. That's still quite a lot of people. And he also put forward the hypothesis at that time that in order to get round 150 people, you can't do it with the fingertips, so you do it with language, and you keep in touch with people in that way. Well, as an archaeologist, I thought this was extremely interesting, but I thought that Robin, as an evolutionary psychologist, had left one part out of it. And with John Gowlett, another archaeologist, we set about to put the archaeology into this tremendous idea that our social lives, drove the actual enlargement of our brain, which makes us so distinct as opposed to other primates, chimps and gorillas and all the monkeys. And we put the artifacts back into that. And I've got one with me here, which of course is one of the masterpieces of the British Museum, which I just thought is worth bringing. And this, of course, is not the original. This is a replica, which you can get from the British Museum shop. So do look it up online. And it also comes with this excellent little book by Jill Cook on the swimming reindeer, also available in the British Museum shop. So do have a look at both of those. But this is the swimming reindeer, 13,000 years old, from southern France, carved on the tip of a mammoth tusk. And this is a stag, and this is the hind, and you can see they're actually swimming across the river, which of course makes them very vulnerable, because this is when people in skin boats can come and hunt them, or as they try and stagger out of the river, they can be hunted with harpoons and arrows and whatever it might be. So this is 13,000 years old, and it's intricately carved with lots of little details. You can see the details on either side. They're carved to give relief and shading. The eyes are particularly well carved. It's probably not going to show up very well on my limited camera facilities, but they're beautifully carved. And the original is just stunning. When you get back to the museum, do go and pay it a visit, and you will see it in all its beauty. It really is one of the masterpieces. But this is an example of staying in touch. These were people 13,000 years ago living in southern France who would have been experiencing the end of the Ice Age. Life was tough. They would have had periods of the year when they had to fragment and go across the landscape, and then at other times they would be coming back into particular areas. And these objects are ways of telling stories, of acting as the keystones for memory, and also for linking across areas. There are shared styles in these artifacts. I'm sure if this was put before a group, they'd all know who made it. They'd all know its history. They'd know how perhaps it even circulated around the group, so that people got to keep it for a short period of time and then passed it on to others at another time. That's a possibility. But this was all ways of keeping in touch, all ways of having a constant reminder of what that other group was, what the larger group that they belonged to was, which they were now actually fragmented from and kept apart from by the fact of having to be socially distant, because that's the only way they could make a living in the Dordogne at that particular time. So that's the art of 13,000 years ago. But art goes back to about 40,000 years ago, and we saw in the Ice Age art exhibition a few years ago, and also in the Living with Gods exhibition, we saw that wonderful lion man from the Stadel cave in southern Germany, the Löwenmensch, and that wonderful piece of part animal, part man, the Therianthrope, is a fantastic piece from 40,000 years ago, and which shows this involvement with other worlds, with the imagination and so on, of being able to go beyond your immediate presence, journey to worlds which exist in the imagination and in the shared collective imagination of the other people in your social group and in your society. So this is how it works, but that takes us back to 40,000 years. Before that, fascinatingly, but unfortunately we don't have any of those objects in the museum, we're now finding that Neanderthals, the ancestors in Europe before we arrive about 40,000 years ago in Europe, the Neanderthals were making art. both cave paintings. It's not particularly riveting as the cave paintings from Chauvet or Lascaux in France might be, but it's definitely Neanderthal art. It dates back to 60,000 years ago, long before anyone like you or me had reached Europe. It's simple lines on the wall, but also handprints. I was here, where they fill their mouths full of ochre and blow over their hands to make that negative handprint on the wall of the cave, which is something that Homo sapiens, you and I, have done ever since. And also, we now know with Neanderthals that they also festooned themselves with necklaces made out of eagle's talons, and that they selected bird feathers in their sights, birds to be black, and they cut up those birds in such a way that they were taking the wings off whole in order to drape around their shoulders as cloaks. So we have a vision here of Neanderthals as being highly decorated themselves and interested in these imaginative worlds. But one thing we do know about Neanderthals is that they never really left the Neanderthal homelands. There are no Neanderthals in North America or Australia or back into Africa or anything like that. Neanderthals were homebodies who stayed in Europe and Western Asia and did not move around, certainly didn't move around like the globe-trotting Homo sapiens who replaced them in Europe. Now, what I argue in my book, let me just get my prop back, what I argue in Settling the Earth, which came out 5 years or so ago, is that it was these sorts of the social relationships that could be built upon the common use of art and objects like this, which represented these shared imaginations that extended across time and space, that really reached in ways that even the Neanderthals didn't imagine. It allowed Neanderthals to separate and then come back together, but with Homo sapiens it was taken to another level, and they could become global travelers and world travelers, so that they were able to live apart and yet stay in touch. They were able to have distant relatives as well as close kin. And it's those sorts of relationships that were supported by objects like the swimming reindeer and many thousand of other objects, but which come very late in our evolution and which represent the great change in humanity. It's quite easy when you're living in a Neolithic village or a Bronze Age town or an Iron Age city to actually keep in contact and actually stay in touch. And you need material culture to organize things. It's much more difficult when there are only 7 million of you spread thinly across the whole world. 7 million, that's less than the population of London. Spread thinly over the whole world and still subject to having to separate because of the environment. So artifacts are the key to understanding how we unlocked our potential to become a global species, how we satisfied this wanderlust, and how we got to every part of the globe, so that when we find in the great voyages of Western exploration, starting with Columbus and coming to its height in the 18th century with Captain Cook and many others, we find that wherever Captain Cook dropped an anchor, he found someone waiting to greet him. Somebody had got there first, and the British Museum is full of those objects of first contact, which are a wonderful affirmation of what we are as a species, which is that we are a global species, able to live apart but stay in touch. And it's our history that allows us to stay in touch. So when we all meet again in the British Museum, members and supporters, I hope to be able to greet you. I hope to be able to talk to you there. I'd love to be able to show you the swimming reindeer and to be able to share that most human of qualities of being able to be together and to be able to share it. But for the moment, take care and be safe. Thank you.